have Krista Lea with us. She is a research analyst in the University of Kentucky Forage Extension Program and the leader of UK Horse Pasture Evaluation Program. She's the lead coordinator for National Producer and Consumer Survey on alfalfa hay, funded by a grant from the National Alfalfa and Forage Alliance. Krista is an agronomist by training and horseman for life. Krista came to Kentucky because of horses and has made Central Kentucky her home. Krista is an integral and essential part of the university forage group. One specialist put Krista's value this way: she does everything and knows everything. When I need to know how to pretty much do anything, I always say, go ask Krista. And that's great advice. Krista is the core of the UK Ag Equine Program's Pasture Evaluation Program. This program is a fee-based pasture evaluation program that analyzes and produces recommendations for pastures on Kentucky horse operations. The program has been very successful due to no small part to Krista's skills in forages, personnel management, and data handling and reporting. Krista's a valuable resource for anything related to equine forages. When Midway University lost their equine forage instructor at the last minute, Krista in to teach that class while maintaining her regular duties. Krista's experience with all things forage allow her to speak with authority with the owners and managers of equine farms, both small and large. Krista has earned the credibility and trust of Central Kentucky horse farms by her hard work and dogged determination to get things answered. Krista, with her husband Russell and daughter Addie, own and operate Texada Farms, a horse boarding operation in Woodford County, Kentucky. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Krista. If questions come up or if anything happens, just shoot them in the chat box and we'll get them taken care of. All right.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that super embarrassing bio that Dr. Henning wrote for me, but thank you all. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here and share my screen so that hopefully, oh, you know what? When we were talking, I forgot to pull it up. So give me 1 second to do that. Sorry, everyone. Well, since you guys all heard about me, I would love to know more about one or two of you guys. Does somebody want to unmute and tell me about yourself and your horses real quick?
There's got to be a taker out there somewhere.
Okay, Linda Stearns will be a taker. We've got 5 Tennessee walking horses and a pony, and we've got 7.7 acres. And actually, I'm wondering about the little yellow poisonous flowers and what I should do.
I'm so glad you brought those up because we are going to talk about those flowers tonight. That is awesome. Anybody else?
Hello, my name is Avery Cole, and I live on a horse farm with Rocky Mountain horses and Tennessee walking horses. We have about 60 acres.
Fantastic. Well, nice to meet you all as well as everybody else. My PowerPoint is almost open. So sorry about that. Mary Jane and I were just having a good old chat and I just totally forgot to even pull it up.
We sure were. I even lost track of time for a minute or two.
I know, we were having a good time, weren't we?
We sure were.
All right. So, okay, can you guys see it in presentation mode now?
It's a black screen and it says, oh, here it is. Yep.
Oh,
there we are.
Okay, perfect. Just took a little bit of a delay there. So, okay, fantastic. So today we are going to be talking about horses and forages. And for some of you, this might be a review, and some of you might be some new information because I was told to gear this to the kids in the audience. But we can definitely have a lot of questions at the end, especially for adults, if you guys have more other questions that we didn't cover. And so I just wanted to cover some things that I think kids starting off with horses really need to understand about forages and about pastures and about feeding those animals. So we will get started. We already talked way more about me than we ever need to do so I'm going to skip that. And here's a couple things that we're going to talk about tonight, how grasses grow. And that's such a basic concept, and yet it really has a big impact on how we manage our pastures. So I think it's something that's good for us to all take a minute and really look at critically. And then we're going to look at some of those common pasture grasses that we see, that we want to see. And we're also going to talk about some toxic plants. Toxic plants are always one of the number one questions I get. About how toxic are they, and should I be concerned, and how do I kill them, and how do I keep them from coming back, and those kinds of things. So we'll cover some of that stuff. So let's start out with this really basic process of how grasses create energy. So grasses and other plants are going to take in sunlight, they're going to take in carbon dioxide, and they're going to take in water, and they're going to turn it into oxygen that we breathe in the air, and also sugar in the form of glucose. So does anybody know what this process is called? You can put it in the chat box, or you can unmute and tell me.
Photosynthesis.
Photosynthesis, very good. Who is that, Bailey? Way to go. This is called photosynthesis, right? So this is how plants go ahead and make energy for them to work, okay? And the way that they do that specifically is inside of their chloroplast. That's the type of cell that's going to collect all of these different inputs and create those chemical reactions to produce that oxygen and that sugar. And what we're most interested in is how the sugar is then utilized. That's what we're going to talk about next. But as we see here, it produces sugar, which is the plant's form of energy. Okay. So where is that sugar then utilized, right? Because if it just builds up a bunch of sugar, that's not that helpful, right? So some of it is used as an energy source to grow additional leaf growth and also for reproduction. So when grasses are going to put up a stem and a seed head, that takes a lot of energy to produce that much biomass. And so that's what they use sugars for. The other thing that they will do is that they will store those sugars in their roots. Okay, so think of your roots as a big storage container or like a battery where we can put energy and we can use it later on when we need it. Now, there's different times of the year that we do these things. We do one thing more than the other. So if we look at this chart here, this shows us how much grass growth or how much above ground growth that we would see in our pasture grasses. And what we see is that there's a lot more of it in the springtime than there is in the fall. Now, this is because these are cool season grasses and they prefer to grow in the spring and the fall. They don't like to grow when it's really hot outside in the summertime, and they also don't like to grow when it's really cold. But in the springtime, we're going to see a lot more of that leaf growth. So they're going to be putting a lot of energy into those leaves, into those stems and seed heads. But in the fall, they're actually going to put the majority of their growth into the roots. And so we're not going to see as much growth on the top, but we're going to see a lot more growth underneath the surface. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about what happens when a horse comes by and actually grazes some grass, or if you're mowing a pasture and you actually mow some of the leaves off. So right here on the far right-hand side, can you guys see my mouse where I'm pointing at? Y'all see that? Yes. Okay, good. All right, so on the far right-hand side here, we see a healthy plant. And what we notice about it is that it has a tremendous amount of top growth or biomass, but it's also going to have a lot of root growth down at the bottom. And we typically assume that what we see above ground is what we also have below ground. Okay, so the more leaves we have, the more roots we have down below. And that is indicative of a really healthy plant. Now, if we come by and we either graze it or we mow it a little bit, and we take some of those leaves off. Okay, so then we've removed some of that leaf surface. Now, what happens in the leaves? Bailey, do you remember? You said it last time for us.
Photosynthesis.
Photosynthesis, exactly right. Okay, so that is the site of photosynthesis. So now we've cut all those leaves off and we no longer have the ability to make energy, right? Because we don't have as much leaf surface. We don't have as much ability for photosynthesis. So instead, the plant is actually going to use some of this energy that's stored in its roots, okay? It's going to use the carbohydrates or the sugars that are stored down here, and those roots are going to physically shrink. So if you think about if you didn't eat any food for a couple of days and you worked really hard, would you lose some weight? Probably so, right? And so that's what happens. The roots actually physically shrink as we use that energy up in order to regrow our leaves, okay? So as we use that energy, then we produce more leaves and we're able to have a bigger plant. And once that plant is back up to its full size, then it's going to start storing more of those sugars back down in its roots. And it's going to grow back into this big plant that we see on the right. The problem though is that all of this takes time. It takes a couple of weeks. And so if we continually graze that plant down again and again and again without giving it a chance to recuperate, then we're going to end up with a plant that looks like this, where the roots are continuing to shrink as it's trying to recover from grazing. And then we keep just grazing it down closer and closer. And so this is how we actually graze out a pasture or an individual plant, is we continue to graze it closer and closer, use more of those root reserves until there's finally nothing left and the plant dies. And so that's why overgrazing and continuous grazing of pasture grasses is so detrimental to those. Okay, so now I want to show you guys a quick video here. Let me take you to it real quick. Let's see if can you guys see my screen still? You can.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So awesome. If you ever want to show this video to others, you go to our Forage extension webpage right here and scroll down to the bottom and click on decision aids. And here you're going to see this video of orchard grass growing. And this is, if you've ever seen a presentation of mine, you've probably seen this video before because I show it all the time. Because it's just a really meaningful and useful video. So we're going to pull it up here. Has anybody ever seen a video of grass actually growing before? Because you're about to. You're about to be blown away. It's going to be the next Netflix series. It's going to be fantastic. Okay, so here comes the orchard grass growing. So on the left here, you're going to see a plant that was continuously grazed down to 1 inch repeatedly versus a rotationally grazed plant on the right-hand side that was cut to 3.5 inches and allowed to regrow. And so what I'm showing you now is after a month of that, what does 7 days of regrowth look like in that plant? Okay, so remember the one on the left was continuously grazed and the one on the right was rotationally grazed. So which plant looks better? Which one do you want for your horse?
The one on the right.
The one on the right, that's exactly right, because there's a lot more volume there, right? So there's a lot more to feed your horse there than there is the one on the left, okay? And so if we were to take these pots off and look at the roots in them, we would see that this one on the left here would have very short, very minimal roots, whereas this one on the right would have much thicker, longer, deeper roots, okay? So that's what that all would look like. All right, so let me get out of here and
Hey, Krista, we
Yes.
saw the picture of the two
Uh-huh.
pots, but we didn't actually see any growth. I wonder if
oh no.
you might have shared, like we saw your presentation slide, not.
Oh, well,
I
that
think
didn't
we saw the
work very
video.
well then. Okay, well, let me try that again then. That is weird. Let's see here. All right. So do you see the website now? Vimeo?
Yes.
Okay. So you should see the video playing now. It's got the intro slides here. Is that what you guys are seeing?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, now we're
you.
going to watch
There we
grass
go.
grow. Sorry about that. I think it's so neat to actually watch it grow. I mean, maybe I'm just nerdy, but I think it's pretty cool to watch. Okay, so now we've actually seen it grow and you can see what a difference it makes. And this is just 7 days of regrowth, right? So if we let it continue on at this rate, think how much bigger this plant on the right would be compared to the one on the left, right? All righty, so get us back to our PowerPoint now. All right, so let me show you guys my recipe for pasture rotation. So everybody thinks it needs to be a really complex system and we have to have all these different paddocks and move all these horses in all these different places. And it really doesn't have to be that complicated, right? So we have 2 different pastures here and we have a horse in it. It could be 1 horse, it could be 10 horses, however many you've got, however big your pastures are. And after a couple of weeks, you're simply going to put that horse in the other pasture. That's all you do. And then you give it 2 or 3 weeks more and you put them back. right? So very simple rotation. Now, some people will start off with something like this, and then after they do it for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, they'll find that sometimes they need to slow that rotation down a little bit, or they need to speed it up a little bit, or maybe they want to add a third pasture in and they'll rotate around those three. So any of those are fine, but if you're just getting started on it, sometimes the simplest thing is just run a piece of hot wire down the middle of the pasture, put them on one side for a few weeks, and then put them on the other side. Okay. All right, so any last questions on basics on grass growth and that sort of thing before we talk about some species? Anybody have any questions? Just raise your hand or chat box or anything. All right, so hearing none, I'm going to go on and look at a couple of common species of forages that we would see in horse pastures. And the first one is tall fescue. So this is definitely our most dominant grass. We like to think of ourselves as a bluegrass-based pasture system, but the truth is we have more fescue than anything else. So if you're looking at it, it has a round base to it. So you'd be able to, if you pull a grass blade out of the ground right at the base, right at the soil, and spin it around, it'll spin in your fingers really easily. It has a dark green color, and it's going to have serrated edges, kind of like a knife. And if you actually spend a whole day sampling fescue like I do, you'll often end up with tiny little paper cuts all over your hand because it's very sharp. It is a very high yielding grass, so you're going to be able to feed a lot of horses with it, or if you're making hay, you can make a lot of hay with it. And it's quite durable and long lived. And the biggest reason of that is because it's often infected with an endophyte. So an endophyte is a little fungus. It's this little squiggly line right here that lives in between the cell walls. And we're going to look at this endophyte more in a minute. So I just wanted to mention it right here. So our next one is the one that we're most known for. This is Kentucky bluegrass. Kentucky bluegrass is going to have a really low growing profile, and it's going to have a fine blade to it. The tips of it are going to be shaped like the front of a boat, like the front of a canoe. So they're going to kind of come up in a little point like this. And the seeds are going to have kind of a blue purplish hue to them like they do in this picture. And so when you get a whole pasture full of them, it'll make the pasture look blue or purple color, which is where it gets its name bluegrass. So that's a pretty common question that I get. It forms a really dense sod, so it's going to have a really nice turf feel to it. So it makes it a really good surface for horses, especially young and growing horses. And it tolerates really low and frequent grazing, which is how horses typically graze. However, Kentucky bluegrass is very susceptible to drought and heat. So when we have hot, dry summers, we tend to see a lot of our bluegrass really fade away in pastures. And unfortunately, in the last 20 years, we've really been tending towards more hotter, drier, longer stretches of drought in our summers, which is really taking a big toll on our bluegrass. And it's probably why we have much less bluegrass now than we did 20, 30, 40 years ago. So unfortunately, we are losing bluegrass in this area, and we have to replace something. And in a lot of instances, it's going to be fescue. The next species that we have here is orchard grass. And to me, orchard grass has a very distinct color difference. So it has more of a blue-green color to it, like in this picture, compared to more of like the dark green we'd see in fescue or bluegrass. It's also flat at the base. So if you can reach all the way down to the soil surface and grab a stem, you're going to find that it's flat and it doesn't spin very well. It does have very soft to it, which makes it very palatable. It makes it feel really nice. Horses really enjoy eating it, that kind of thing. It also has excellent forage quality, and it tolerates shade very well. So it does good overseeding into an existing pasture. It does not, however, tolerate close grazing, which is what horses do. And it typically is only going to live about 4 or 5 years in a pasture. So orchard grass is one that we have to constantly reseed in a pasture in order to maintain it. And the last species we're going to look at tonight is white clover. So it's actually not a grass, it's a legume, but it is that horses really enjoy. It's very low growing. As the name suggests, it has a white flower. And unlike its big cousin red clover, it does not have any hairs on the stem. So if you pick up one of these and it has some hairs either on the stem or on the underneath side of the leaves, then that is actually red clover. So if you don't have a flower, that's how you can tell them apart. It prefers cool and wet conditions, so it really enjoys growing in the springtime. It produces very high quality. If you've got founder prone, laminitic prone type horses, then they may not be able to tolerate that much of it. And it does spread very aggressively, particularly in overgrazed areas. So if I go out to a pasture and I see a lot of white clover, that tells me there's probably been some heavy overgrazing out there. So now let's look at a couple of poisonous pasture plants. And I shortened this for the rest of the presentation, PPP, poisonous pasture plants. And here's so we get a lot of questions about this. But one thing to remember is that all horse pastures have some type of toxic plant. Okay, there are so many more toxic plants than we actually talk about. And it's all a matter of, are the horses willing to eat it? Do they have other forages present? Will they choose those other forages instead of the toxic plant? How much of it does it actually take to affect the horse? And does it affect all classes of horses? So there are very few weeds. It's just a blanket. It's toxic no matter what, right? And there are a few of those. But a lot of weeds and a lot of other species, it's more of a gradient. It's how much did they eat? Are they eating other things? Are they the right type of horse that it's going to have an effect on? Okay, but we are going to look at a couple of these. So somebody mentioned earlier these little yellow ones, and these are buttercup, and we're going to look at those next. So Jaden, you have your hand up. Do you have a question?
So we are we going over like the poisonous pasture plants, like some of them individually?
Yes, we are. Yep,
Okay.
That is what we are going to do next. And we are going to start with these buttercups here. I think that's my next slide. Oh, nope, it's not. It's tall fescue. So we'll come back to it. So tall fescue is one that I would consider a poisonous pasture plant because it is infected with that endophyte. And while that endophyte is really good for the plant, it can be really bad for our horses. However, it only affects brood mares that are in their last 60 days of pregnancy. So if you have some geldings or you have even some mares that you're not breeding, fescue is not really an issue for them. And so we're not really concerned about it for them. But if you are breeding horses on your farm, that's where we're really concerned, specifically that last 60 days of pregnancy. And the signs and symptoms we're looking for is going to be prolonged gestation, low milk production, and difficulty foaling. Those are the most common symptoms that we'll see in horses grazing fescue. Okay, this is the one everybody asks about, is buttercup. So who here, raise your hand if you've ever seen buttercup in your pasture? I'll admit it, I have it in my pasture some, right? So we've all had some buttercup. So buttercup is a winter annual, which means it's going to be germinating sometime between December and now is where it's just starting to grow. So we won't actually see those flowers until late April, but by that time it's really too late to make a lot of control options for it. It tends to grow in heavily grazed areas. So it's another thing that tells us whenever we've got an overgrazed situation. And it is quite toxic to horses. However, they rarely consume it. So buttercup toxicity is really not a huge issue in horses, especially in this area, because typically we make sure that they have plenty of other forages available. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't worry about buttercup. I'm saying that if you do have some, you need to make sure that they have plenty of other forages to choose from, and they'll typically select other things over buttercup. So not as really as big of a red flag for me compared to like tall fescue in most horse pastures. Johnson grass is another one that we get a lot of questions on. Johnson grass is a perennial, so it's going to come back year after year. And it is a warm season grass, so it prefers to grow in the heat of the summertime instead of the spring and fall. And it can contain high levels of cyanogenic glucosides. And what that is going to cause, it can cause some spinal cord distress and some ataxia in horses, but they have to actually eat a fair bit of it and for a long time. So my understanding is that it's 3 or 4 weeks of pretty continuous high intake before we really start seeing an issue. So again, another one of those plants that we're actually not that concerned about in pastures. It doesn't like to be mowed close or grazed close like most horse pastures are maintained. So it tends to not be a huge issue in horse pastures. It's really unsightly. And so when people see it, they get really worried about it because it's very visible where it grows so tall. But like I said, horses, they really don't eat it that often. If they do, they're probably not eating enough of it to be a big issue. So Johnson grass is another one that I don't worry with quite as much as some others. Okay. The things that I worry about most with horses is landscaping. And those are where we see the most poisonings with horses and toxic plants. So there's lots of different landscape hedges and bushes that you can see. This one here is called yew, and it's a decorative hedge. And we see it lots of places. And when people come in and they trim it, instead of throwing it in the trash can or in the compost pile, they'll just pitch it over the fence into the horse pasture. And then the horses will eat it, and it is incredibly toxic and will kill the horse very quickly. Jaden, did you have another question?
Sterney's Stables just posted a really good question in the comments.
Oh, okay. I did not see anything in the comments. Let's see here. What about some fescue in fescue hay for pregnant mares? We have mostly orchard grass and timothy hay, but there is some fescue. Yeah, that's a great question. So fescue, and specifically the toxin within it, can actually persist in hay, although it's rare, to be honest with you. And the easiest way to check if you're concerned about it is to ask your county extension agent to take a core sample of that hay and send it off to the diagnostic lab, and they can actually analyze it for the toxin. As I said, it's pretty rare that it persists in hay, though it does happen on occasion. But it is pretty stable. So if you test it now and it tests low, then 6 months from now it's still going to be low. And if it's high, then 6 months from now, it's still going to be high. So that's a really easy way to check hay, because it's quite stable once it's in the baled form. Now in a pasture, it is much more unstable. And so we see a lot more variations in pasture. And so it's a lot harder to really put your finger down on when a pasture becomes too toxic for brood mares. So that was a great question though. And one that I get a lot, especially this time of year. Any other questions on that? Okay, well, hopefully that helped. But if not, throw some more in the chat box and I'll check it here in just a second. But coming back to the landscaping, this is truly where we see our biggest issue with horse pastures, or with poisonings in horses, is because people take plants that don't naturally grow in pastures, particularly decorative or ornamental plants, and they throw them into the pasture just to get rid of them. And then horses are curious and come by and eat them. So don't do that, basically. And if you're hiring a landscaping company, make sure that they're not doing that either. Let's see here. And I think that is the last of my slides for you guys. So I'll leave you here with a picture of my reining horse at her retirement party. We threw her a whole party when she was retired. So I will be glad to take any questions that you guys have. You can either throw them in the chat or you can unmute and just tell me your question.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so it seems like, and I could just be biased or wrong, but does it seem that buttercups are more prevalent in horse pastures as opposed to cattle pastures, and why?
Yeah, no, absolutely true. And the big reason is that horses graze so much closer to the ground. And so it's that much harder on grasses to recover. So we tend to overgraze horse pastures a lot more easily than we do cattle pastures. And that's why we have a lot more weed issues in horse pastures compared to cattle pastures, not just buttercup. So if you think about how a cow actually grazes, they use their tongue and they wrap it around the grass and pull it into their mouth, right? So they have to have like a minimum of 6 inches to do that. So it's really hard for cattle to graze too low. Whereas horses, they use their lips to pull it into their mouth, and then they use their teeth to actually bite it off, and they can do that right into the ground, right? So they can reach down and eat the grass right into the dirt. And so when they do that, it kills that plant and it leaves an open space where something like buttercup can then come in. So that's why we see a big difference.
Oh, thank you. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So there's a question in the chat box says, do you recommend a 2,4-D type product this time of year to work on the buttercups? Absolutely. This is absolutely the time of year to be spraying for buttercups. In fact, my husband and I just sprayed our farm this past weekend. 2,4-D is a great product for buttercup. You can use other herbicides. They're typically going to be more expensive and they're going to have longer wait times. But 2,4-D is a pretty basic one, inexpensive, and it's still very effective with buttercup. So between now and like mid-March is a great time to be spraying for that. If you wait till April, you're going to knock it back some, but it has already put out its seed, and it has already spread quite a bit. And so you're going to have minimal effects on it, which is why now is a much better time. What month should you start seeding grasses? Another great question. Ideally, we seed grasses in the fall in September. However, especially if you seeded in September and then we had a drought like we did this year, sometimes we'll come back in the spring and kind of overseed to fill in some bare areas. And if we're going to do spring seeding, then anywhere between now and the end of March would be the best time for that. So March and September are the best months for grass seeding for cool season grasses.
Do you recommend,
Mhm.
oh, I'm sorry, I have a question.
No.
Do you recommend if we like broadcast seed or drill it? Or does it
Yeah,
depend on the seed type?
Yeah, for most grass seeds, it is much better to drill it than it is to broadcast it, simply because we're going to get that seed in the right spot in the soil and get a good seed to soil contact. Ryegrass is probably the exception to that, where we can get away with broadcasting it. It's still better to drill it, but it's not as important. However, sometimes you just can't get the drill, right? You can't rent one because they're all taken. Or it's too far to drive and you're only going to be doing a little half acres or something. And so if that's the case, then you can take a chain drag or even an arena drag and drag over the pasture, broadcast your seed, and then drag over it again. That's not going to be as effective as a drill, but it's still going to be more effective than not putting seed in the ground. So drilling is always best, but dragging and broadcasting is still a viable option, especially on a small area. So there's a question in the chat box that says, how long do you keep horses off the pasture after spraying for buttercup? That is a highly personal question. So the research officially states that you do not have to keep horses off of a pasture for any length of time for any herbicide that is labeled for use in Kentucky. Now, most people will keep them off for a couple of days or a good rain shower just to be safe. On my farm, we kept our broodmare off for a couple of days just to give that product plenty of time to dry. But the rest of our horses, we simply didn't have a place to get them off, and so we didn't. So the research indicates you don't have to. I recommend, just to be on the safe side, a couple of days or a good rain shower. A lot of times the restrictions for lactating dairy cows are the most conservative. And we typically encourage people to use those for pregnant mares, again, just to be on the safe side. But really the thing that they're most worried about is those herbicides getting into the meat and milk and then ending up in the food supply. And since we don't eat horses, that's not an issue for us.